When we went to school, we learned Ireland was once covered in forest, in the fertile parts of the country. No forests in the Burren or the mountains. It's hard to believe that around these parts there was a solid cover of ash and hazel and oak, whitethorn, blackthorn, brambles and briars. Lovely. Gradually then, people cleared the woodland to till the land, graze their animals. Wood for fuel, wood for building, wood for ships. Wood for the powerful roof trusses in Dublin and London, until we only had a few scrubby patches of woodland left. And even they are in danger. Bigger towns, bigger roads, airports, bigger fields, all take a toll on the forest. The forest is nearly gone. What's left is like an animal in the zoo. Isn't it grand, the poor old forest? Listen to me now, and believe me, the forest hasn't gone away. The forest is here and real and waiting for its chance to take back its place. Walk away from your garden, your driveway, your pebbles and patios. Come back in 5 years. Nettles, brambles, briars and little trees are moving in. Give it 100 years. Forest. Now here's an example. Not 100 years ago, not 150, 170 years ago this very year, a family lived here in Fingal, along a small road, off another small road over the high hills of Hollywood and Knockbrack. 7 little clay houses, thatched roofs, in the lane. Parrigans and Dolans and Burns, then our people Duns, then 3 more. There was no wealth to be seen there, but they'd all got by for years. Big families, all worked, nearly all on the land, for farmers, big and small. They had room to keep a cow and a pig or two, grow a bit of oats, good patch of potatoes, work for 6 days, mass on Sunday, church holidays, bit of free time, an odd dance down at the cross, an odd trip to Balbriggan, sell the eggs, get a few luxuries, look out for one another. But hopefully none of the neighbours would get above themselves. This year was different though. First thing old Bill Cole died in March, single man. His house was empty. The previous year Parrigan's potatoes failed completely. They couldn't feed the pig. The cow had to be sold. Mick lost his job. So they could do nothing, only go into Dublin to Bridie's sister in Red Cow Lane, gone in April. The news from the country was terrible. The south and the west people starving, dying in their droves. Paddy Dunn said to Sarah one night in May, "We're lucky to be in this part of the country, Sarah. I have my job in Knox's, we've spuds in the ground, the children are well, they can read and write and figure, we'll be grand." On the 1st of June, Dan McNally was arrested. For what? Nobody knew, but he didn't come back. His woman and 3 little children had no option, only go down and into the new workhouse down the road at Balloch. The poor creatures. 3 empty houses in the lane. Lar Bourne worked along with Jem Bourne in Knox's farm down the road as well as Paddy Dunn. One day that same week, they were heading down to Knox's yard to yoke the horses into a mowing machine. Marvellous machine. Out to the meadow and down with the blade. Lar was arranging the bar when the horses chucked on. The blade snipped his hand off as neat as you like. Poor Lar was left bleeding, crippled, destroyed for life. He survived. There was a few pounds collected for the Burns. They moved off in the end of July to Balbriggan and opened a little shop. Hand-to-mouth existence. Poor Jem Bourne got blamed for the accident and got the sack. With what they had, they made their way to Drogheda, and Jem and Anne headed to Liverpool on a boat. 5 empty houses on the lane. Potatoes were a complete failure. Paddy looked into Mahon's little field on his way home one hot and humid day in the end of August. The stalks were black and stinking. He ran down the lane as tired as he was to his own garden. He could smell the blight before he got there. Disaster. The next week, the 2 Mahons were sick. Dr. Kenny was called for, the priest was called for, but none of them could get there in time. They were old, the poor old women. And off the Mahons went down to Hollywood graveyard. Sarah and Paddy Dunn, one little thatched house occupied in a row of 7. No spuds. Paddy had his job. And farmers' potatoes down the east side of the hill seemed all right. It was a battle to survive. They're 2 strong little boys and 1 strong little girl. 24th of September, old Simon Knox died. By the 30th of September, Paddy had no job. A nephew of old Simon's had shut down the farm because it really was a charity for the poor. 10th of October, Paddy and Sarah Dunn and little John and Pat and Sally stood up from the table. They left the cups on the table, the pots at the fire, the picture on the wall, and walked out the door for the very last time, over the road, down the hill of the Nevet, on their way to the north wall of Dublin and a voyage to a foreign country. The next year, grass and weeds grew up in the lane and on the thatch, and down the years the land took back the marks that people had made. Now there's the sign that a lane might have been there, wide spots along the way where cottages stood, where people were born and lived and laughed and loved and cried and died and left. But the forest has taken it back, as it will surely take back the planet when the time comes. Christmas Eve to some people is the best night of the year. Dark and cold and busy. It's a getting ready night, and when the getting ready is done, there's little time for a little peace. Paddy Farrell was totally at peace, warm outside from the good log fire in the pub, warm inside from 3 bottles of ale, 1 more than usual. Not that Paddy was a big drinker or a regular drinker. He worked hard, a great stockman. He was in Burke's for years, but every 2 weeks on a Saturday evening, when he had a few shillings extra, maybe a nixer with somebody else's cattle or sheep, he'd duck into the inn for 2 bottles of ale. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Sharp, took a dim view of this and didn't hesitate to let her daughter know. "Bridget, you could have done so much better, you know. Ale leads to stout, and stout leads to whiskey, and whiskey leads to the poorhouse. And that's where that lad'll leave you, yourself and your 7 daughters. Mammy, you know, Paddy puts his wages down on that table every Saturday of the year, and only when he has a few bob of his own he goes in for a drink and a chat. We never wanted for anything as long as we're together. Now, Bridget, I think I know more about life than you," and so on and so on. All sharp by name and sharp by nature. But anyway, Christmas Eve, Paddy was on the 3rd bottle and he was as happy as a butcher's dog. And the reason for that was at home in the cradle. The last blast, the last sting of a dying wasp, just under the wire, in spite of the age, the weather, the 7 daughters, and even Mrs. Sharp, his first and only son, a healthy, handy, happy, hardy little boy. And Paddy was well justified in being pleased. There was a fine turkey at home, a full ham, all the spuds and vegetables they wanted. Everyone was provided for, all the girls, and great girls they were, working in Balbriggan, some of them in the chemist shop in various places, another doing a bit here in the bar at weekends, and he had a little present in his pocket for Bridget. Time to think of home, but in came big Tom Larkin. Tom had been trying to headhunt Paddy for years. "Sound man, Paddy, well done on the little fella. Sure, you'll have a football team before you're done. You'll have a bottle of ale." "I'll have one, thanks, Mr. Larkin, but I better head up the hill then. It's just one thing that's annoying me, and it's not much. Thanks be to God for the child and everything, but I thought I'd like to call him after my father." "So that's the same name as yourself, Paddy?" "Ah, no, my father was Patsy. I was called after my grandfather, old Paddy Farrell. But anyway, the mother-in-law and Bridget want to call him after some of them old lads in the Bible, or a pope or something like that. I heard the name 50 times, but I can't think of it. You'll swear it was 1838, not 1938. "Is Mrs. Sharp up for it?" said Tom Larkin. "'Deed she is. Then it'll take a better man than me to go agin her." "Would you not think you coming down to work with us, Paddy? I'd give you twice what Burke has given you." "I wouldn't let them down. There's just myself and old Barney left there now." "Please yourself, Paddy. The offer is there. Happy Christmas to the lot of you." That's a great man, thought Paddy. Rising up where others are sliding down. Good management and hard work. The Burke's place where Paddy worked was definitely on the slide. When he started there was 10 men in the yards and the fields. Beef cattle, purebred sheep, blood horses. Now Paddy and one other owl fella could keep it going. If the young Burke lads couldn't turn it around, it'd be sold. Pity. Paddy poured the last of his bottle and was making for the door when in came Hardy Jack. Hardy Jack was the postman, a mine of information, heard everything first. Have a bottle, Paddy. Little wiry man with a big nose. His mother said all his life, poor Jack is delicate. He'll not see 10, not see a long trousers, not see 20. You wouldn't kill him with a pickaxe. Loved football, fighting, big breeches up to his armpits, helping farmers, anything. He was an unofficial staff member on a dozen farms in the parish. He'd be down off the bike, hanging up the post bag like a shot. No surprise to see Hardy Jack flying around the yard on a cow's face, jumping on a wild sheep or unblocking a drain. He was a rare one, and he had a great creed for coping with life. He applied it to the weather, the postmaster, the government, the clergy, wicked dogs, wicked owl ones. Very profound. He'd say, you wouldn't want to give a shite, and the good nature was in him. Paddy me life, Anya, says he. Anyone can make a teapot, but a craftsman has to put the spout on it. It's great to have a little son. I hear Mrs. Sharp wants to call him some queer name. Deed she does, says Paddy. I don't know what way he'll get on at all. I'll tell you, Paddy, you wouldn't want to give a shite, says Hardy Jack. He'll be the same young lad no matter what he's called. If a horse was called a cow, he'd still win his race. And with that, Hardy Jack set off out the door, up on the bike, like a blackbird on a gate, and away down the road. There was still post to deliver and people waiting for it. Paddy emptied his last bottle. Good night all, and a happy Christmas. He set out up the hill. 5 minutes later he looked back, a glow from the village, and up the far side a glimmer from the farmhouses and cottages. No moon, no star, a dark Christmas Eve. There were bad times coming in the world, in Europe and in Ireland. Even in the Farrells' happy home, before that world war was over, everything would change. Paddy fell foul of a cough that became a flu, that became a fever, that brought him to his grave, leaving poor Bridget 7 tearful daughters and a little son. Even Mrs. Sharp was heard to say, as bad as he was, we'll miss him. But that was all yet to come. It was Christmas Eve. Paddy was stepping home with a half-dozen good bottles of bravery in him to face the future. And as he said to a peer that he met along the road, Hardy Jack is right, you wouldn't want to give a shite. This is a little piece about your place. You're going to find place names around every town and every village in this country. One of them is the Remount Farm in Lusk. Listen and see. A foal was born in a stable on a farm in County Meath. A long time ago, nearly 120 years. Almost every farmer in the country kept a few mares those days. Horses were the power units of the time. Horses ploughed the land, sowed the crops, brought in the harvest, and horses transported the farmer and the family to the town, to the church, to socialise. The horse moved the country and the world. So, keep a mare or two. She can work with the best and produce a foal every now and then. If the young horse is not needed on the farm, it can be sold without any bother, bringing in a few pounds, pay a bill or two. Back to this fellow, born near Navan around 1900, and because of the year that was in it, they called him Century. Century had the perfect lifestyle for his first 3 years. Grass to eat, hay in the winter, a warm stable in the cold weather, shady trees in the summer. He was a bit of a pet on the farm, being quiet, curious, and when breaking time arrived, he was very keen, eager to please, easy to handle. And then it was time to go, out into the world. It would be nice to keep him, but there were 6 strong horses on the farm, and more foals growing up. People need money. So Century went to the horse fair in Navan. A new experience for a young horse from a quiet farm. 70 or 80 horses, ponies, donkeys tied up on the fair green. All sorts of potential buyers, dealers and chancers trying for a bargain. A street of owners hoping for a killing. Century was a fine animal. His dam, that's his mother, was a mighty Clydesdale mare, sheer pulling power, but the sire was a fine thoroughbred stallion. Century had the looks, the power, and a nature to die for. A hunting man from Slane took a shine to him, but on the day Mr. Wilkinson from Dublin bought Century, and another 18 horses. Mr. Wilkinson wasn't just another horse dealer. He bought for the British Army. He and his agents toured the country, from farmers to breeders to horse fairs the width of the island, to provide war horses, pack horses, horses and mules to haul guns, supplies, ammunition, you just name it, around the far reaches of the British Empire. Wherever the Atlas had a pink piece, there was a need for Irish and British horses to do their bit. In wild parts of Asia and Africa, as well as preparing for turmoil at home in Europe, horses shared all. They tilled the soil, drew the carriages, they went to war. Century's first step was to take the train. His mates wanted nothing to do with this noisy, smoky outfit, but Century took it in good part. Loaded up, the others followed him. Good sign for the future. A handy trip into Dublin, then a transfer to the Great Northern Railway, and in no time that train pulled in at Rush and Lusk station. The horses were mustered, and down the lane to the gates of the British Army Remount Establishment, Dublin branch. The Remount Farm, as everyone called it, opened for business in about 1890 on a ready-made site. It had been for 60 years a prison, not a prison for convicted criminals, but more of a rehabilitation area for minor offenders, and an internment centre for potential enemies of the established government. The prisoners worked the land under guard, served their sentences, which were usually short. Most of them were in transition. They were well looked after. Physically, they had work, exercise, food and accommodation, and spiritually. They were allowed to attend the local churches in specially designated areas. But in December 1886, the prison closed down. Maybe the crime rate had dropped. Funnily enough, there was a certain amount of disappointment when that happened, because a prison brings some advantages to an area, employment and business for retailers and so on. Anyhow, within a few years the Army Remount Farm had taken up the slack and opened up for business. Perfect site, 170 acres, access to the long estuary and the common for exercising, training. As even the War Department did nothing by halves, even though there was plenty of accommodation from the prison days, the builders moved in. As far as I can see, there was a constant programme of planning and building for almost the entire working existence of the Remount Farm. Stabling for the horses was first and most important. The farm was designed to handle up to 360 horses. They needed good quarters, so brick-built stables were provided for them. Horses need feed, so barns and feed stores had to be built, all top standard. Horses need a drink, so water had to be piped to every field on the farm from a tank on a stand in the centre. The water was pumped into the tank by a big single-cylinder paraffin engine, must have been a Crosley, and then flowed by gravity to the drinkers in the fields. The constant sound associated with the base wasn't the bugle calls or the orders or the neighing of horses, but the slow thud of that big old engine. This was the sound that greeted Century and every horse and mule coming in that gate. They had to get used to it, and they did. No rest breaks for travel-weary horses, and was straight to work. These animals weren't here for a holiday, but for training. Some horses, like Century, were broken before coming to the remount, but most were just as nature made them, so they had to be broken from scratch. Every man on the premises had 4 horses to look after. Each horse was exercised, trained to accept a bit in his mouth, a bridle on his head, a saddle or a straddle on his back. They went to the breaking field every day. The breaking field was a smallish field with good fences, and was covered entirely with sand, harrowed every day. The reason for the sand was to slow these high-spirited young things a bit, and to make sure neither man nor horse injured themselves. The idea was that 6 weeks after coming in the gate, each horse was ready to go out, qualified for war, to obey every command, to carry their rider, to or through every obstacle, or to tow wagons, ammunition, supplies, gun carriages through every possible terrain, through fire or water, and to do their duty through what could be a very long or a very short career. Our horse Century proved to be an exception. All horses can swim and do it very well, but young stock are reluctant to take to the water. Century spent a lot of his youth crossing the Boyne River. It was no novelty to him, so he was used as a leader. The young animals followed him into the Rogerstown estuary without a murmur. This was a horse who did have a holiday. Under his jockey, Robert Hall, Century learned his craft. He could stand, walk, trot and canter. He could jump any obstacle, swim any distance, and lead any shy young horse into any scary situation. So much so that when 6 weeks had passed, Century was kept in Lusk to instruct more newcomers, while his peers were shipped to near and far around the world. What about Robert Hall and all his colleagues? These men were all serving members of the British Army, from all walks of life, from all parts of the British Isles, married and single, teenagers to 40 years old, and according to the census records of 1901 and 1911, almost all literate, Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians. Before army life, they had worked as plumbers, butchers, labourers, ploughmen, grooms. Now the one thing they had in common was horses. Daylight to dark, duties revolved around horses. Easy ones, difficult ones, big, small, bad-minded. That was the job. These men had pretty good conditions. Quarters were good and constantly being improved. Married men's quarters were perfectly adequate. Food was good and plentiful. The single men's quarters were again as good as any, and better than plenty of civilian homes at the time. Again, says the census, the ranks were privates, corporals, lance corporals, sergeants, a sergeant major, and some commissioned officers, up to Captain Beamish, who seems to have been officer in charge, and lived in the big house along the Rush Road, still there, the house, not the captain, next door to the establishment. The camp doctor was Dr. Brian Cusick, who became a member of the First Dáil. A few local civilians found employment on the farm, not too many in general labour and maintenance, but in general the remount brought commerce to the area, supplies for men and hay, oats and bedding, which had to be sourced from farmers around Fingal. The very sound of the army buyer was enough to bring anyone to attention in the hope of a good deal. The plans which are here are enough to show what a well-run, well-planned establishment the Remount Farm was. It looked like a rock, something to last, particularly during the first decade of the 20th century. Things were fairly peaceful in the country. Of course, there were wars and rumours of war, but nothing out of the ordinary. Century, the big bay horse, worked away, heading for middle age. The weather during this decade was the finest for many, many years. Winters were mild, summers were splendid. 1911 was supposedly the best summer for 90 years. Mr. Wilkinson and his agents were constantly busy. Up to 2,000 horses a year passed through the Lusk Remount Farm, as well as through the other bases at the Curragh in Kildare, in Woolwich, Melton Mowbray and in Reading. By 1914, Lusk had become a squadron, 200 men and officers, a busy, contented unit with every possible facility, right down to a library to keep the men's minds improving. The library is one of the very few remaining buildings on the site. Coming into 1914, with the clouds of the Great War beginning to gather in Europe, it looked as if this Remount Farm was going to expand and grow. Surely the demand for war horses was going to explode. But the war itself was what brought the business to a close. Modern trench warfare with the appalling carnage on men and animals turned it all around. The internal combustion engine became the new horse. It didn't need training or feed or bedding. Soldiers no longer needed to be grooms or vets or farriers. They just needed to go over the top and be blown away. Then, from 1916 onwards, Ireland entered a very different phase of history, and a British Army base had no place here. So suddenly it was gone. No bugle calls, no trainloads of horses, No use for the mess halls, the dairy or stables, the detention room, the sick bay. The buildings were gradually demolished, the land let out to farmers. The last remaining stock were shipped out or sold off. Plenty of plough and cart horses worked on around Lusk and Rush. A hunting man, Captain O'Callaghan from Rathbeal, bought a big old bay horse who never refused a ditch or gate or a river, a horse called Century. Today there's little enough trace of this busy establishment. The few remaining brick buildings look lost among new developments, new roads, Orland Park, a few stone markers in the fields. It's the story of Ireland, a story of history, a few remnants of frantic busyness. Down at a farm near Kentstown, a few ivy-covered walls and a stray lilac bush. For a minute, I want to talk about photographs. They're surely the greatest thing that happened in history. Every home has its own collection of old stuff. Dog-eared, black and whites, yellow, sepia. People captured in a moment. Real, living, thinking, working people. Frozen in time. I met one such photograph on a Friday during this golden summer of 2013 in that excellent Museum of Country Living down in Castlebar. Black and white, a man standing beside a half-finished straw mat, a thin, grey-haired man in his late 50s, and beside him, his only child, a very serious 9-year-old boy. An old-fashioned man in his own field, showing his own skill of an autumn day in 1963. 50 years and a bit more. I know all this because the little boy in the picture is myself. And the da, Pat Monks, was a dab hand at making anything from the produce of the land. From Rush St. Bridget's crosses through straw mats, bee skeps, sugan chairs, willow baskets, to the grandest little bits of carpentry. Even 50 years ago, he was an old-fashioned, self-sufficient man. Anyway, less than 4 years after the 1963 photograph, Pat had to leave behind his tools and his trades, and his stone house and his whitewashed yard, his animals, his friends, my mother and myself. And down he had to go to his early grave, the quiet and kind and gentle fella that he was. And a lot of a lifetime has passed, and a lot of change has taken place in half a century. But since that day, when I saw the photograph, I took to thinking about the da, and the people he dealt with on a daily basis. You could never call a farmyard a lonely place. And as the seasons changed, you'd have to cope with all sorts of people who were handy in one way or another and made themselves indispensable. I can cast my mind back and remember a procession of characters, like pig stickers, horse breakers, bull cutters, horn doctors, dog trainers, rick builders, sack carriers, stick sellers, ploughmen, tractormen, spudmen, Jewmen, chimney sweeps, wall builders, well diggers, tailors, cobblers, tinsmiths, whitesmiths, blacksmiths, drovers, higglers, tanglers, dealers and jobbers, and that's just the half of them. Every one of them is worth a story. I'm remembering just one, a dealer. Small word to describe a man who is prepared to buy or sell any living thing at any hour of the clock, any day of the year, in snow or in sunshine. As big as a bull, as small as a hen. His father before him was an accomplished dealer. He'd moved from the Galtee Mountains to the outskirts of Balbriggan in County Dublin, and he built a hell of a business with the farmers and butchers of the North County Dublin. He bred a bundle of sons, but it was the second youngest son who was the chosen one, the Dalai Lama of sheep and cattle dealers. Mick, we may as well get on first terms. Mick was wrestling with arithmetic in the Tech in Balbriggan. He must have been 14 years of age at the time when Mick Sr. landed into the classroom. Here, says he, enough of this. There's a fair in Anniscall in the morning. I have to bring sheep over to Matt Rooney. So you may get the train now to Tralee and get a lift out to the fair. Buy every white-eyed heifer you see, but don't give any more than £7.10. Them other lads of mine wouldn't buy eggs in a hen house. And so started a career in the razor-edge business of sheep and cattle dealing. In the 1950s and 60s, practically every farmer in the area kept sheep and cattle for rotation and to eat surplus vegetables. And our man Mick kept them supplied. The name of the game was to attend the fairs in Cork and Kerry and Tipperary or Limerick, ship the livestock home on the train, then put suitable bunches together for different farmers and make the margin as big as possible. Sounds easy. It's anything but. Stock had to be paid for on the nail at the fairs, but Fingal farmers liked a bit of credit. Or maybe they wouldn't buy because of any number of factors. I'd buy that cow, but there's hens in the shed. No problem, Mick would say, I'll buy the hens off you. You're better with a drop of milk than an egg. Next step, find a punter for the hens. The business grew, things changed, CIE got awkward, enter the van, the scut truck, the cattle lorry. Now Mick could arrive any time. I hear you sold the black bullocks, I've 10 rare ones here in the lorry. The word no was a waste of wind. Let them stand into the yard, I won't charge you for looking at them. Once their hooves hit the ground, it was all over, bar the technicalities. During the farming expansion of the late 60s, Mick had orders for all sorts. One of the neighbours ordered a Hereford bull from him. Now, Hereford bulls were scarce. They were as scarce as millionaires at the time. But Mick located a young bull in a little farmer's place up above Waterville in County Kerry. The only problem was, the calf had been reared in the house, and one day, a contrary old collie bitch bit the 2 ears off him. Mick bought the bull, and sold him to Tommy, the neighbour, in the dark, 2 nights later. When Tommy caught up with him, the answer was, are you going to talk to him or let him bull cows? I can well remember that big roan bull for years and years doing his job for Tommy, not an ear in sight. Trade-ins now were a problem for Mick, awkward enough to work out the prices. I remember a man calling in our gate to him once upon a time. He said, hey Mick, what's Horn Joe's worth? He said, nothing, it'll be worth less next week. Once early enough in his career, Mick found himself in the town of Rush in County Dublin on a sunny summer's evening. He'd come to a football match and his lift had disappeared. He got talking to a decent man in the area, Garvey Butterley from up the road. Turned out Garvey had a short-horn cow for sale, and Mick wasn't prepared to miss her. So he made his deal, paid up. Gee, she was terrible cheap. And he thought, how will I get her out of this town? If I leave her, Garvey will sell her again in the morning. But no transport. So he put his hand on the red cow's hip and walked her out the Whitestown Road past the graveyard and on to Bow Hill. She was a quiet old doll. There was no traffic. So she rambled on, taking an odd mouthful of grass. Up the hill past the big house gate, Peels once upon a time and related to a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Across the railway bridge and into Lusk Parish, the Remount farm on their left. On the way into the village, Mick had to put up with plenty of slagging from the boys playing handball. But he could give as good as he got, and better. Up the street, he met his first potential customer, Bill Sweetman. Mick, I'm buying nothing till after the summer. Right, Bill, you're not the only pebble on the beach. Mick and his cow kept walking through the green, past the church, and west out that old Quickpenny road. I wonder where that name came from. I've searched and inquired, but no result. Now there was a problem for Mick because it was getting late for calling to clients. Even though it was a fine June evening, Mick was wondering as he passed the Bilrother Union farm on his left. 100 years before, those fields would have been full of inmates of the workhouse, all quiet now and in ruins. Though neither Mick nor his cow realised it, this was the very road taken by Donald MacMurrough O'Mailachlan and his Meath men in 1135 on the way to burn and pillage the abbey in the town of Lusk. Donald didn't make the return trip. Some Lusk man left an arrow in him at the shadow of the round tower. But at Hedgestown School, Mick took French leave and let his cow into the playground. Plenty of grass. And he laid himself down on the bank. It was nearly midnight, and at 7 that morning, he'd been selling heifers in Screen in County Meath. So a rest and a sleep were indicated. Lord Howth had donated a hunting lodge of his to house the first school here in Hedgestown, to educate the children of his tenants in the area. It had many a threat of closure, but it's going strong to this very day. Daylight comes early in June, so Mick and the cow were on their way before 4 o'clock, under the wires at the 5 roads and heading into the west, through the Nevet and the Cross of Nacalia. Nobody up yet, so they kept walking. Hollywood, a busy place for hundreds of years, has been slowly decaying since the dissolution of the monasteries. Now it's just another grey ruin, a quiet little graveyard tucked into the hill. The next crossroads, the Nag's Head, had a tavern for thirsty travellers up to about 1860. No chance of refreshments here for a cattle dealer and his cow. George Sherman in Damastown was an early riser, could be a buyer. Mick, I wouldn't take her for a present, keep going. There's a grand little church at Damastown here, part of the Knoll and Ballybuckle parish. Parish priest Father Hatton fed a few cattle. But no, any cow bar a red cow come back when you have a black one. Under the trees at Malahau, the home of the Baker family. Originally rectors of Hollywood, about the same year as Mick made his trip, a foal was born in that field on the right, to one of their mares, Bright Cherry. He was an accident-prone little bugger. He managed to geld himself on the barbed wire. But they dressed him up and brought him off to Gough Sales. They called him Arkle. On the bend here is a yard called Fanning's Walls. I don't know who Fanning was or why he built the walls. This stage, Mick had about 12 miles on the clock and no sail. But he turned right for Garristown at Spring Hill and stepped out. Across the field on the left is the Grolla, another ruined church, graveyard, a holy well. Somebody deepened a ditch in the 1970s and the holy well ran dry. Such is life. Baldwinstown is quiet enough now, but 250 years ago it was a flyer. It had mills for corn and cloth, timber merchant, shops, taverns, all gone. The two travellers made a right turn there and pulled up at Jim Keogh's two-storied house. Jim didn't surface too early, so Mick lit a handful of gravel at the top window. "Have a smashing cow for you, Jim." "How much, Mick?" £12.10. "Turn her into the shed and I'll give you a brief in a minute." The word check was never said in polite circles. It was always a brief. Mick collared his brief, got a lift to Balbriggan with the bread man. He had to be at a fair in Kilmallock the next morning. There's a full book to be written on this man's exploits. He worked the trade until his health packed in 2010. Then Alzheimer's took hold. The last time I saw him alive, I'm not sure if he knew me, but he said, "Good man yourself, any chance of a brief?" He was the last of the cowboys. Someday this'll be 100 years ago. It's what we say when we try to put events into perspective. Joys and sorrows need to be looked at objectively. How will history look at current affairs? Because, believe me, we're always making history. And history has tamed a lot of events. Events that looked hugely important in their time have been levelled out by a few centuries. It's almost 100 years since Ireland's Easter Rising, the rebellion, as some still call it. Easter week 1916 shows no sign of being levelled out by history. From the reading of the Irish proclamation in the middle of O'Connell Street to Pádraig Pearse's surrender in Moore Street 5 days later, that rebellion left a mark on Dublin, on Ireland, on Irish people, which will never be erased. Very few Irish people don't have an opinion on the Easter Rising, and they vary from "it was the best and most glorious event in Ireland's history" to "it was the most foolish and despicable act during Ireland's 750-year relationship with Britain." Extreme views make the bookends. In between lies reality. Irish Home Rule was on the cards, had been for decades. The Irish Party were labouring away slowly in the face of opposition from British politicians and Irish unionists. But some semblance of agreement had been reached. Then came the First World War, the Great War to end all wars. Everything was parked for the duration of the war. This war being fought for the defence of small nations, don't make us laugh. It was fought for political gain, for economic domination, even for the power to exploit and colonise far countries. Enough about that. Home Rule was on the back burner. The leader of the Irish Party had gone on record as saying he would not discourage Irish men from joining British regiments and fighting on the Western Front. Thousands did, and thousands left their bones there. Thousands were never the same afterwards. Thousands were shunned by their own countrymen. War is no good. People wondered, would Ireland ever rule itself? A generation had been nourished on the Celtic revival, stories, myths and legends, plays, poems and paintings. Hundreds of years of plantations, religious difference, unsuccessful risings, wars, emigration and hunger were coming to a head, and a mixture of people were winding it up. From hard-headed revolutionaries through practical soldiers, out to idealists, teachers, dreamers, all of them up for striking a blow to keep Ireland's case alive. The rebellion was doomed to failure before it started. Even if one whole section of the rising hadn't been stood down at the 11th hour, it still would have been destroyed by the British military machine. The British War Office feeling completely indignant, backstabbed in their darkest hour, and prepared to demolish the entire city if it suited them. No, it went ahead. There was talk of a blood sacrifice to shock the Irish people into action. A bit frightening, but that's what happened. And who knows what was in the minds of young and not so young men that Easter weekend, when they set out to walk or cycle from Rush and Lusk to where the action would be. Thomas Ashe, the Kerryman, the schoolmaster of Carduff, had educated them in Irish history, the legends, the music, the sport. And they were going where he went. That was to the Rath Cross, to the Battle of Ashbourne, which has been written about by plenty of men who were actually there. That battle at the RIC barracks was the only successful mission of the entire rising, and the men of Rush and Lusk and Turvey and Swords weren't slow to point that out. After the rising, after the surrender in Dublin, the reprisals came, executions. Britain's heavy hand was responsible for weakening and wakening up the peaceful majority of Irish people. The Irish volunteers, who were reviled on their way to the boats taking them to prison camps, were cheered on their way home. Coming along was a different rebellion, the War of Independence, a guerrilla war, a rough business. The Irish Free State was on its way. And in spite of the differences that were forged between people in 1916, and between the political parties that grew out of it, the important part of the title of the name is free. If that tree fell, it'd destroy the whole place. So said young Martin Larkin to his father one breezy evening in September. And what'd make it fall, said Tom. It's in the prime of life, straight as a rush, not a crack or a break on it. Divil the foot it'll fall. That tree was a beech tree, surely 60 feet tall, probably 150 years old, and yes, in prime condition. It was right beside Larkin's yard gate, and when some old Larkin man in the past planted it, he didn't give any thought to the size it would grow to. There was already a few low branches amputated to let in loads of hay or straw. But Tom had dug in on the thought of the tree being cut. It wasn't going to happen. Look, we can't farm like this. You were always a go-ahead man, but we can't go ahead with an 8-foot yard gate. That was a fair point. One side of the gate, the tree. The other side, a galvanised shed that held everything that didn't have a home somewhere else. Machinery, forks and shovels, bits of hay and straw. The dog had a corner. There could be emergency accommodation for a cow or calf or a few sheep. Stuff that came out of the house, like bed ends and three-legged chairs. Not great now, but not bad enough to burn. Everything. A smashing shed. Now, the big problem now was the new tractor. The yard gate was fine for the little grey one. Boot Farrell could fly in and out on that, no bother. But now, the new Fordson Super Major had arrived, a rare yoke, full of power, fit for a 2-sod plough, a 12-foot trailer, a corn drill. Problem. The steering was fairly heavy. In fact, you could do with a piebald pony on the seat with you to turn the bloody wheel. And the Martin lad wasn't about to be disgraced by having to do a 3-pointer at the gate. He was up for a 16-foot gate. Kelly's had a 14-foot gate, nearly unheard of. Martin was going ahead, and the beech tree was in danger. Tom was fond of that tree. He met it every day of his life, going out, coming home. The day he got married, the day his father died. First thing he saw, the tree. He was a tough man. He'd built up a good business and he'd cut his share of trees. But this one was the tree and it was going nowhere. Martin could just take his time on the major. 8 foot would still let in a lot of business. Martin was up for making an issue of the tree. The tree was in the way of him getting his own way. For effect's sake, it was the 1960s, and it sickened him to see the wide gate on Kelly's. Even Burke's had a wider gate than theirs, and they were as old-fashioned as a haycock. No, the tree had to go. He had to make a stand, or he'd never get the better of the old fella. They always got on fine, mainly because Martin hardly ever challenged him. Wednesday evening, Martin was putting in the dog. He was hardly worth keeping. Just he'd bark his head off if any stranger or animal was loose around the place. Apart from that, he was just handy for licking the pan. Martin took a hard look at the bloody big beech tree, still green. It was only September. The All-Ireland was coming up, Down likely to win over Offaly. Kerry feckers were doing their bit as well. Poor old Dubs were having a poor time of it. And there was the feckin' tree, waving at him in the breeze. And a good breeze it was. He could see the scar on the trunk where it absorbed an iron post sometime in the past. A cart axle, according to the old fella. We'll have to watch that when we're cutting it down, thinks Martin. That was a decent night of wind. Storm Debbie, said your man on the wireless, until the electricity went off. The only hope was to go to bed and try not to worry about the creaks and groans and crashes, slates flying, glass breaking, buckets, barrels, cattle roaring, dogs barking. The mother with the beads out. We'll say the rosary again. Hail Mary. She heard you the first time. 106 miles an hour at Malin Head, the Independent said. A trail of destruction countrywide. Millions of pounds worth of destruction. Solved the gate problem in Larkins too. In the morning, the beech tree was as fresh as paint. But the shed was above in the orchard.